Hey everybody, I'm Sonja and we're here at Rework AI for Good Summit. I'm joined today with Danielle Deibler, the CEO and co-founder of Marvelous.ai, fighting the good fight on the internet using natural language processing and deep learning. So, do you mind telling us a little bit about what you're doing on the internet?
Sure. So we are building a platform for narrative detection. Our first use case is really essentially politics, and we're following the U.S. 2020 presidential election. So mostly Democratic candidates right now, because there are just so many of them. And then as we kind of get past the primaries into the general, we'll hone in essentially on kind of who the contenders are. But we cover social media, online news, and then kind of downstream comment sites like 4chan, 8chan, and Reddit, and we kind of combine all of those together to get a view of what are the narratives that are pervasive on the internet about the candidates that are kind of going across all of those three genres of online media.
Wow, so I had understood that. I knew that you were dipping into social media and stuff, but I feel like a lot of people don't dip as hard as 8chan and 4chan and
a lot
the
comes
depths
from
of
there.
The internet,
Yeah,
so.
a lot really comes from there, especially if you look at kind of the look back in like 2016. There's been tons of studies recently, and you see a lot of things that are coming from more of those comment sites that are like kind of leaking into or being amplified on social media, or even sometimes being picked up by mainstream news and then amplified on social media. So it's important to kind of realize that there's a lot on the internet, and that the world does not revolve around Twitter, right, or Facebook. There are a lot of different places that people, especially around politics, will speak their views.
Right. Interesting path to get into.
Yep.
I love people fighting the good fight on the internet. What sparked that for you? What kind of got you into it?
It was basically two things. It was a lot of the studies that got posted, probably I would say in the 2017, 2018 timeframe. Looking back at what happened in 2016, it was the Mueller report, right? And we started before then, but it didn't seem that outrageous to me that there had been some kind of state-sponsored like propaganda operation or misinformation campaign or amplification inside of kind of the U.S. from another country. It happens in Europe, and actually Eastern Europe, all the time. So it happening to us just seemed like it was foolish that we weren't willing to acknowledge it. So, but what really got me into it was everything was looking back at what happened in 2016, and I want to know what's going to happen, right, in 2020. And in order to do that, you need to be collecting the data real time, you need to be analyzing it in as near real time as you can be, you need people to be looking at it and understanding what it is.
Right. So I guess, processing information that's already out there, tweets that have already happened,
Yep.
Past tweets, past information. What are the challenges of working with information that's already out there versus real-time, monitoring stuff in real time, I guess?
So I would say one of the challenges probably with working with historical information is you have to have the data set, right? But a lot of times those data sets become available, or someone will do a study and they'll release their data set. So you can go back in time a little bit easier. The real-time stuff is a little bit harder, right? You need to be looking for the right things. If you can't take the whole Twitter fire hose, for instance, right? You need to have really good targeted search that gives you a nice representation of what's being said. You need to double check yourself pretty much constantly. It is hard sometimes to kind of connect the dots in real time in terms of where something's coming from, what the provenance of a particular story or tweet or link that's being shared. So there are definitely pros and cons to kind of both approaches, but in terms of what's needed to combat misinformation, you need to be monitoring it in real time.
Right. So I know that you use kind of a combination of different things, like natural language processing, deep learning. Can you talk a little bit about that, like the processes that you use?
So we use an unsupervised clustering algorithm that actually clusters tweets and news together, and then it looks for essentially the most common words, the most common worded, or the most closely related word embeddings. So in our corpus, for instance, salad and comb are very closely related to one another, and that is because a few months ago there was a story that circulated about Amy Klobuchar, who's one of the Democratic candidates, that she ate salad with a comb because a person on her staff did not bring back utensils, and that she was apparently kind of bent out of shape about it, according to the Twitterverse, right? So it means that our embeddings are very unique to kind of to U.S. political contests kind of in general, and specifically the candidates that we're following. And that's great because when we generate one of those labels essentially on those clusters, even though it's unsupervised, they're pretty close to explaining to you what's inside of that cluster. So 25,000 tweets gets kind of boiled down to 4 words. And then further down on that, we also look at semantics. So we look at joy, anger, distrust, so a little bit more than fine-grained than positive, negative, and neutral, to kind of understand inside the cluster what's the emotional manipulation that's taking place, right? What are they trying to stoke in someone? There's not a lot of joy, I will say. That is one of the emotions that you can actually measure, but there's not a lot of joy in U.S. politics, at least not right now.
I can't imagine, yeah.
And then further down the pipeline, we also we use human in the loop to hand tag essentially the narrative that is associated with a particular cluster of tweets. So there may be like 20 clusters that are associated with one kind of overarching storyline or narrative. And then we're just in the process now of creating clusters and auto-assigning those clusters into specific narratives based on the training data that we created. So we're using a lot of different techniques to kind of, we're pretty much completely agnostic. If we can solve the problem and it's a way to solve the problem, then we're going to use it.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What are some, I guess, the biggest challenges kind of discerning between, I guess, like a malicious force that's kind of shaping the narrative and truth?
That's a there's very little like flat out totally untrue things. I mean, there are some, but actually there are many. But what's harder is understanding something that is wrapped kind of in a grain of truth, right? And then it's like a statistic or data that's been manipulated to support your position. That's a lot harder, and I can't tell you that we've solved that problem, right? But we have looked at kind of, it's a multidimensional kind of issue where you're trying to figure out how is this person motivated, right? So are they kind of left-leaning or right-leaning? Is it a suspicious account in social media? Was it created since 2016? Does it have 5 numbers, like, you know, leading the username? Do they use a lot of suspicious hashtags? Do they hijack hashtags, right? And they're writing about something that potentially isn't really super related to that. There's a lot of factors, right, that go into it. Do they tweet a lot of really kind of like non-credible sources, right? Is it a lot of RT and Breitbart that's being tweeted out, right, where they're kind of trying to stoke the flame, so they become kind of somebody that you're suspicious that you start looking at, or they become part of a cluster of essentially suspicious activity that you look closer into. So I can't say that there isn't a magic bullet, I don't think, and I think a lot like kind of other cyber warfare, right, other kind of like infosec problems, it's going to be an arms race to try to counter the tactics that are out there. But if you don't start playing, you actually never get armed, right? To protect yourself.
You're not even in it.
Yeah, you're not even in it, exactly.
Slightly on topic, slightly off topic. I guess the one thing that's kind of scaring me coming up, especially with the election and fake news and everything, what are your thoughts on deepfakes and how to kind of gauge that and I guess preventing
We're not really
misinformation?
not doing images, right? So we are very focused on the NLP side. I think eventually we will start looking at things like memes and stuff like that, but that's not our area of expertise. Now on deepfakes in general, I think Adobe announced an initiative, I think I want to say like a week or 2 ago, that talks about kind of watermarking in a way that you can tell if an image has been modified. I can't say that I think that's the solution to deepfakes, but I do think that you need like the camera manufacturers and the software developers and things like that to collaborate on that, because they can help essentially to tell you whether something has been modified or what's been modified in a particular picture, down to a pixel, and that seems like a good collaboration, right?
Yeah. I always like to ask what's next and what's coming up, but I guess for you it's the 2020 election.
It's the 2020 election.
So
We have 2 initiatives actually. One is the 2020 election, and then we're working with a nonprofit called Credibility Coalition, and we're working to develop essentially the equivalent of the MITRE attack matrix for misinformation. So essentially a standard way that you track it, you understand it, you classify it, and then you counter, right, and measure the effectiveness of countermeasures. So it's just like malware spreading across the internet, right? It isn't exactly that way, but it's a lot that way. You identify the signature of it, and then you add it into a virus scanner, and now you've got a way to protect against that particular variant. So if you try to frame it in that way, you can kind of start to get a framework so that people can start to use that framework to develop products and services that can help to combat it. We have a larger strategy, obviously, like in terms of we could do help with brand management. You're starting to see misinformation actually in the private sector, like against companies. So we think there's a bigger kind of business here, but we did a different thing that I think a lot of companies do. We said, you know what, the mission is the thing that's the most important, and we can probably make money later, right? But if you don't do the mission, then we're kind of in a bad spot, right, in terms of as a country at the very least.
Right. I think I appreciate that a lot. It's, again, like I said from the very beginning, fighting the good fight on the internet.
Yep.
So that's incredible. Where can people keep up with you?
You can hit our blog at Marvelous.ai. And then we're not super prolific on Twitter, but we talk on Twitter. And then email us, info@Marvelous.ai, and we'll get back to you. You can even email me, Danielle at Marvelous.ai, and I'll get back to you.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks for joining us today.
Yep, thank you very much. Awesome.